Hey guys, welcome back to another video for Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. So today's video, what I want to do is kind of compare this to something that PSO does as well, which is how the game uses what's called environmental storytelling. So I have done a video on this similar for PSO previously, where I sort of explained how PSO provided story through cues in the environment, as well as some very subtle guidance in the game as well. For the most part though, PSO's story is told primarily through message capsules and through things that it shows you in the environment to draw your own conclusions from. And I wanted to show how NGS kind of does the same thing with this as well. So a lot of people probably don't even notice a lot of this when they first play through NGS, honestly, but there is quite a few cues on Halpha that give you an idea as to what's going on in the story before you're even told. So what I'll do is I'll show you a few of these around the map, just to get an idea of how the game actually subtly tells you what's going on in the story without actually telling you straight up. So I suppose your first bit of storytelling is right at the start of the game, when you obviously crash land in your pod and you arrive at Alio Town. This is kind of setting up some basic story for you. So from this you can tell that you're clearly not from this planet, you've come from somewhere else. Obviously later on you find out that you are likely from Lucille. So this is kind of your first clue to your character not being like a normal resident of Halpha. You know that you've crash landed from somewhere else. The game doesn't really tell you where from at the start. You just know that you've arrived in this capsule and you obviously get rescued by Aina and Manon. So it's clear from the start that your character in particular is not a typical Arx defender and you're clearly not from this planet. So we're now in Halpha wetlands, and this is another prime location that really does give you a lot of environmental storytelling. So first of all, you'll notice this kind of thing all over, particularly in Alio, but also in some other regions like Retem as well, where you've got these large sort of support frames. These are clearly not natural, but you can see they go into the cliffs. So this is kind of a subtle hint that maybe Halpha is not all as it appears. You know, by looking at this, you can tell that these structures almost look like they're supporting the cliff face. And that is kind of one of your first hints in the game that Halpha is not exactly a natural planet. As you know, the more you play through the game, Halpha is basically like an artificial testing ground to test Arx against dolls. So this is kind of a leftover sign of that. So it is interesting that the game kind of shows you things like this even before you get here in story, but before you actually find that out in the story. Just by looking around the map, I remember when the game first launched and I saw things like this immediately rang alarm bells with me, because I thought, well, this doesn't look natural. There's clearly something artificial going on here. And it just made me start thinking straight away, is Halpha an artificial planet? And that's the whole point of this kind of storytelling, really. It's meant to start you asking questions and disputing what's laid out in front of you. At the end of the day, the game could tell you that Halpha is a natural planet all it wants to, but if you keep seeing things like this all over the planet, you're going to start doubting that. So that's one example. The other example in Halpha wetlands is the large building in the middle. So what you'll notice as you travel around, particularly in Alio, you'll notice that a lot of the areas that feature water tend to have some kind of like industrial architecture with them as well. So this building, I'm pretty sure that this building is some kind of water tower. I don't think they ever actually explain what this is. But the fact it's in the middle of the wetlands, and it's surrounded by all this other sub-architecture as well. But you'll notice this in a few places, so generally anywhere that's got water in Halpha, there'll quite often be some kind of architecture near it, or that will lead to the water. And I think the implication with that is that they are maybe something like water generators that are essentially providing the water for the planet, because again, if Halpha is artificial, then it needs a way of being able to create that water. You can also see, if you look even in the water here, you can see that everything under the water here is entirely artificial. You know, we're not walking on rock or like a seafloor or anything. This is literally just entirely artificial. So it does raise a lot of questions. Again, you can also see things like this in other areas. So if we go to Halpha Lake, for example. Again, Halpha Lake got this big wide open area. So, although we have this lake here and it might look natural at first glance, again, if you keep walking around it, you can see, if you look very careful at the water as well, you can actually see that the water is rippling from this location. It might be hard to tell on camera, on the video, but the water is kind of rippling outwards from here. And if you look, again, we have another artificial structure. And this looks like vents. So this is likely where the water is being generated from. So again, it's just pointing to that fact of Halpha being a completely artificial planet. But there are queues like this all over the world. I think Alio is probably the easiest region to see it in, which is probably intentional because it's the first region that you go to. So they want to implant that thought in your head very early on. Yeah, these little queues are everywhere though. So again, this is likely to provide the water to Halpha Lake. So again, there's another one over here as well. So again, if you stand still, you can see that the water ripples out from it. And again, it's another one of these artificial vents. It could also be a drain, but when you look at the water, it does look like it's rippling outwards from it. It is kind of hard to tell though. But to me, it looks like it's rippling outwards as if that's providing the water. So again, we're still in Halpha Lake here, but we're down towards the shoreline that connects to SEGA. And there's a few things here. So again, if you look down across the shoreline, again, we've got the structures poking out the cliff faces. Again, just to reinforce that Halpha is an artificial planet. There's also these things floating in the air. These are basically like force fields to divide the different areas. Now, obviously part of that is a gameplay reason because they don't want you to be able to just travel to another area before you have the rights to do it. The other reason though is, again, this could be something that's been set up by Lucille to sort of gate off different areas of Halpha. Because again, Halpha is meant to be like an experimental planet where arcs are basically tested against the dolls to try and strengthen the arcs. So it could be that there are different test zones on Halpha, which correspond to the different areas and different biomes. And these are maybe a way of splitting those up so that the tests don't overlap with each other. So again, if you think about it logically, there is a reason why these could exist. Also, we've got the tunnel that leads to another area. You know, this is obviously force fielded off before you have access to it. This is, as well as being a way to, in game terms, this basically acts as like a hidden loading screen, more or less. But this is also kind of a reference as well. So I've been playing through Phantasy Star 3 recently on my channel, and this essentially feels very similar to how Phantasy Star 3 does its maps. So each of the maps in Phantasy Star 3 Generations of Doom are connected via tunnels, and the tunnels link to completely different biomes. So I'm pretty sure that this is more or less a direct reference to that. So I mean, you can see that the biome changes completely between Alio and SEGA. SEGA is very volcanic, and then Alio is completely different. So it's a very, very stark contrast between the two biomes. And it's the same for every other region that these tunnels are in as well. All the biomes are completely different. So I think, as well as being a very convenient way of hiding the loading screens between the different zones because they are in different instances, I think it's also a bit of a callback to Phantasy Star 3 as well. I'm not saying that NGS is linked to Phantasy Star 3 because I'm pretty certain it isn't. I think it's just more like a little reference to the older games, which is pretty cool. So we're now in the Return region and we're at McQuador levels. So I've made these into photo rooms just so there's no enemy spawning, but when you look around this area you can see it's like a huge industrial plant. Now, judging by all the tubing and piping, I'm assuming it's designed primarily to deal with either liquids or gases. And given all the structure that we've seen on Halpha, I wouldn't be surprised if this was like a water processing plant, personally. Now, the reason I think that as well is because, as well as having all the piping that would support that kind of theory, we've also got these large cylinders over here. Now, there are cylinders similar to these in Dresen Plant as well, but they're obviously for a very different purpose. These ones, to my knowledge, I don't think ever have any dolls inside them, because the ones in Dresen actually are like storage pods for dolls. These ones, I think, are always empty. It just looks like they're full of liquid, so I'm assuming that this is either a water processing plant or potentially some kind of coolant or something along those lines. The other reason I think it might be something to do with that is because if you look at its location on the map, you can see that McQuador level is underground here. It is very close to the coast, and it's one of the lowest areas in Rotem as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that pipework leads to the coastline. Maybe this is the way of providing or regulating the sea around Rotem, potentially. Again, it's just a theory, just me spitballing at this point, but that's kind of my theory for what McQuador level is meant to be. But it is really, really interesting looking at this. Again, it's just a lot of environmental storytelling that the game does. And again, I think a lot of this probably goes over a lot of people's head. I think part of that is maybe because a lot of people just don't really engage with NGS's story, which, you know, I get. But I think if you go around looking at the world in NGS, you can pick up different things just by looking at what is around you. And you can kind of draw your own conclusions from it, which I really like doing. I think as a PSO player, I really like that kind of storytelling. So next in Rotem, we've got this floating island at this area, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of because I have no idea how you pronounce this. It's something McQuad. I can't remember how you pronounce the first part. But this area is really interesting. So you can see there's a lot of these like floating cubes going around. Now, if you do any of the quests like Darkfall's Solus or anything like that, what you'll notice is that a lot of the map and everything that they use for those quests has the same kind of architecture. So these kind of glowing cubes, for example, this kind of stuff is used a lot in the Darkfall's quests. And you probably notice as well that when you defeat Starless bosses, they tend to disintegrate into little cubes as well. So this to me is kind of a link telling you that this is connected to the Starless. It's a very, very subtle thing, but... And as you'll know, if you did this area when it was active, you used to fight a Starless boss here. So I think that maybe the significance of this kind of architecture here is a link just telling you that this is connected to the Starless. It's quite subtle, and it is a bit of a grasping at straws thing, but I do feel this is meant to be indicative of the kind of area that's meant to link to the Starless. So now Enquiries, and even some of the really subtle hints about Hals Origins are shown here. So you can see, and again, you may not even pay attention to this when you play the game, but this tree is glowing. So if you look close to it, you know, all of the bark is glowing. It looks like kind of the snow that's gathered on it is all glowing. Now you can see that some of the trees are not, but some are. And it's almost like these trees are being used as like a light source, like an ambient light source. It's very weird, and something that definitely stands out. And you can see that as the weather changes, they actually fade. So you can see that that's now faded behind me. So you can see there is definitely a light source coming from these trees. So it's a really, really interesting thing that they've done. And I'm guessing it's meant to be like a subtle way of lighting the area. So what we've got here is the entrance to Lost Central, which again, if you've done story, you know what Lost Central is. As you come in, you can see we've got that big sealed door. So again, you can tell it's completely artificial. If you then take a left here, you're probably familiar with this part from story, but you can see that this is clearly a recreation of, or rather Central City is like a recreation of this. So when you first get here, you may not know a whole lot about it. You kind of learn a lot more about Lost Central as you go through the story. But again, just the environmental storytelling in the area, even if you just sort of skip through the story and didn't really pay any attention to what was going on, just by checking out parts of this area, you can kind of put two and two together, because just by coming in here, you can tell this looks like the bridge from Central City. And as you come into Lost Central even more, you start to understand what's going on. So you can see the remnants of old buildings. They're all wrecked. And you can see what appears to be another version of the central tower. So again, even if you completely skip the story and had no idea what Lost Central was, just by coming here you can kind of put it together, particularly when you get to here, because this is more or less a one-to-one recreation of Central City. You can see here you've got these buildings on the side, which would have been shops. And then they lead up to the actual Central Tower itself. Obviously the Central Tower is all closed off, but you get the idea. So I think even if you weren't doing the story and you just skipped the entire thing, by coming here, the game is giving you an idea of what Lost Central is meant to be. So I think it does a really good job of that, of explaining the significance of the area. So that even if you do decide to skip through everything, you still kind of know what's going on here. So we're now in Dresen Plant in Styr. And this obviously is a very major place in the story when you first get here, because you kind of learn about what's going on with the dolls. So this, again, entirely artificial. This was clearly built by someone. And as you explore around Dresen Plant, you'll notice these pods, much like the ones in McQuad, but these ones you can see when you go close to them actually have dietills in them. So we have like boss dolls in them. So I think it's explained later that this is basically a manufacturing plant for dolls. Again, because Halpha is meant to be this test planet, they need to be able to continually test arcs, and to do that they need to continually produce dolls. So this is the place that it's done. Again, if you didn't engage with the story at all, just by looking around, it might not be too obvious at first, but just by going close to these tubes, you can kind of tell, okay, that's clearly a boss doll that I've fought before. So from that, you can see there's a lot of them. There's one in more or less all of these. There's a few empty ones, but the majority of these are filled with dietills. So you can tell that this is like a large-scale manufacturing plant for dolls, which is exactly what Dresen Plant is. It's a really cool feature, I think, the way that they show this. Again, we've got like a very similar infrastructure to what was in McQuad, but for a very different purpose. Again, you can see all of these tubes are going to the actual, all of these pipe work is going to the tubes that the dietills are in, so very important place in the story. And again, very, very easy way of explaining what's going on just by doing environmental storytelling. So back in Elio again, and just another thing to note is quite often you'll see on the rock faces, it's similar to what I showed earlier with the false architecture poking out. But what you'll notice is that at certain points in Elio's cliff line, you will see that it's exposed, and you get these like mechanical parts or very obviously artificial pieces. And you can see this is actually part of the cliff face. It's almost like the rock faces fell away and revealed this. And these are in quite a lot of different places. So you can see there's another one up there. Again, this just all sort of ties into the illusion that that Halpha is a completely artificial planet. And this is something that's ingrained in you from the very start of the game, more or less. I think another thing that the game is really good at for environmental storytelling is how it introduces Lucille. So Lucille, obviously, is floating directly up there. That has been there since the start of the game. And when the game launched, a lot of people wondered what this was, because it was just this ominous thing floating in the sky that just wasn't mentioned in the story at all. And people wondered what it was. And obviously, as you do more and more story, you realize that this is where Zefeto is doing the experiment from. So he's basically monitoring what's going on Halpha from there. So obviously, he's in a perfect place for it because he's directly positioned above Halpha. So it makes total sense. So even though this was in the game from the very beginning, it got people's minds wondering what this was actually for. And you basically just start putting two and two together. We've got this floating thing in the air. We've got a planet that's got hints of it being not exactly entirely natural. There's clearly some artificiality to the planet. And people kind of putting their own theories together even before the story really went anywhere. So it's been really interesting to see how the game tries to tell you things about the story without explicitly telling you. And I really do like that. Again, it's the way that PSO did a lot of the story originally. And it's a method of storytelling that I do really enjoy. Like it allows the player to kind of try and put their own conclusions together about what's going on before it's actually explained in the story. I mean, for me personally, when I started NGS, the things like the parts of the cliff faces and all the artificial things you could see immediately set alarm bells off for me. And I thought, there's something not right about this planet. Why is there water generators everywhere? Why is, they're like scaffolding poking out of all the cliff faces? It looks very artificial. So even from the very beginning of the game, I was starting to wonder, is Halpha a real planet or is it something else? Obviously, you'll learn later on the actual reason that Halpha exists. There is more I could go into. There is things like the Nameless City as well, which is a whole new kind of worms. But I won't go into that for this one. I just wanted to do a quick video basically just to show you how NGS does this environmental storytelling in a kind of similar way that PSO does it. And I do kind of respect that that's a thing that's kind of carried through the franchise. I know you may argue that NGS's story doesn't really go anywhere. For the record, I think it has improved recently. But there are elements of the story outside of the story quests that the game is giving you that might not be as obvious. So next time you run around Halpha, just take a look at what you see, and you might be surprised what you can work out just by looking around. So I'll leave that on there. If you enjoyed the video, please consider either liking, subscribing, or joining as a member on YouTube if you want to. You can also follow or sub over on my Twitch, which is SectionSkyly. I have an X and a Bluesky, which are both SectionSkyly, and I also have a Discord channel you can join as well, which I'll leave a link to in the description. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.